I'm Dave Munichello, managing partner here at Google Ventures, and we are super excited to be hosting Flapping Airplanes. With us today is Ben, Asher, and Aiden, and they're going to share a little bit about the company and the path that they're on. Great to hang out with you guys. Really excited about the announcement of the funding round for the first funding round for the company. Obviously, we've known each other for quite a while, Ben, and we've gotten to know each other through this process, and really excited to partner with you guys. GV feels like the moment that we're in is a time to invest in AI differently. So the rest of the world is looking at scaling and this orthodoxy of scaling AI. You guys are thinking about AI a little bit differently. I'd love for you to talk us through the beginning of this company and what you're planning on going after.
Yeah, so I think AI is a very big space these days, obviously, and there's many different things to do. And so one thing that I think became clear to us in the last maybe year or so is that people have now actually run the scaling experiment, and it works. Like, we know what it does. It's actually very effective in certain ways. We also sort of have gotten a sense of what its limits are, right? That scaling gets you all kinds of advantages, but it has not magically solved all of the world's problems either. And so, if you'd actually asked me to start like an AI lab something like 2 years ago, I actually would have said, no, it's not the right time to do a new lab. The scaling thing hasn't been run yet. Like, we need to go do that. We need to see what's going to happen. But that's now happened, right? It's 2 years later. And all of a sudden, I think that the world is actually in a much more idea-constrained regime than it is in a data or compute-constrained regime, especially, that we actually just need better ideas of what to do with all of the immense resources, the immense compute build-out that's going on right now. So, we sort of thought about, okay, like, what's really wrong with these systems? And our conclusion is that most of the problems, I don't say all of them, but most of the problems actually stem back to kind of data efficiency in a very fundamental way, which is that your ability to get as much intelligence out of a small amount of data is much more closely linked to the kind of underlying creativity and generalization of these systems. Being able to extract intelligence from the sum totality of humanity's knowledge is sort of less difficult, less interesting than being able to do it kind of in the way that humans do. Where if we look at kind of the orders of magnitude here, humans are probably being trained on something like 1 million times less data for the same intelligence as current frontier models. It's a really big factor that we're missing. We also think this is a really important problem from a kind of a commercial point of view, which is very simply to say that, like, if you can make models work with 1 million times less data, you actually make them 1 million times easier to deploy into the economy as well, that you don't have to go out and collect, trillions of tokens of traces to make them do any job. You can actually do it in a much more reasonable way. And so I think this also very much informed our hiring strategy, which was to basically say, we don't particularly want to be focused on whatever the prevailing wisdom is around this and saying, okay, let's go be the large-scale empirical. Let's actually work with incredibly smart young people that actually in some ways don't know what they don't know and are willing to go back to basics and figure out, yeah, this is the reason why this thing is actually fundamentally right. This is the reason we're going to make this decision, and here's the trade-offs of it. If we can do that, in a reliable way, I think we can do. We can get there, sort of smarter, not harder, if that makes sense.
Totally. A typical question for founders is, how did you meet and how did you get to know each other? Ben and Asher, as brothers, you guys have known each other for quite a long time.
We met early in life, yeah. Yeah, I mean, so we are very lucky. Me, Ben, and my sister have a really spectacular relationship that I think our parents did a really good job fostering. We have basically never fought, which is not to say we haven't argued, but we have never fought. I think, it is really a privilege to be able to found a company with someone that you have complete trust in and you understand everything they're amazing at. You also have 25 or 26 years of context of the things that they actually need a little bit of support in. I think that makes us really effective at working together. I mean, we definitely complement each other. Ben, has this amazing reality distortion effect that allows him to pursue really ambitious things. At the same time, on the operational front, I think he finds it helpful when I jump in from time to time. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, so I think there's lots of, there's lots of things like that.
I agree. I think that it's actually, I at one point wrote a blog post that was sort of vaguely about this, about sort of hive minds working together, that when you are in a regime where the goal is to just get as much stuff done as possible, actually the degree of interrelatedness of two minds is not necessarily as important. But if the goal is to do a small amount of incredibly high quality work, of which actually running a company is sort of mostly of that form of you're not making 1,000 decisions every day. You're trying to get a couple of key things right that unblock the company to get to the next step. Then having extremely high degrees of context on the other person and what they're good at, what they're bad at, and how to best support them actually becomes really instrumental. And that's something I think that we have a particularly unique advantage on, that we understand each other very deeply.
That said, I also want to say I haven't known Aiden for quite as long as I've known Ben.
I wish.
And do you mind sharing a little bit about how you initially met both of these guys?
Yeah, I initially met Ben through a mutual friend, and I was just incredibly struck by his creativity and how quickly he grokked new ideas. If our models learned remotely as fast as Ben, we would be $1 trillion company already, but you'll have to give it a few years. And then I talked to Ashwin, again, similar thing where you get the spark of brilliance. You have a really, really deep conversation, and you understand that these people get things in a way not that many people do. And in building flapping airplanes, it's been delightful every day to experience that same spark of brilliance.
The last thing I'd say, when I first met Aiden, like you were saying earlier, there's this great thing about Ben and that we're trying to have the company embody, which is like, sometimes when someone says something's impossible, like you look dejected. You're like, well, I guess it's impossible. For us, when people say things in AI are impossible, we sort of get excited. We're like, wow, there's this really important problem that nobody's working on.
It's like more space for us.
Yeah, exactly. It's great. And I think I really got that sense that Aiden is the kind of person where if you tell him something's impossible, he is like, he doesn't believe you. He's excited to try it.
I really like the classic game theory thing with the speedboats, where if you're following someone, you're just going to be extremely lame. You're going to lose every time because you're just following them. But if you go around, if you take some risks and you try things that no one else is trying, you might just whip out ahead on some lucky wave, or you might be successful in a calculated maneuver. And I think that we are a calculating crowd.
So as you know, the early rounds of this company have been highly competitive in the ecosystem. And one of the first questions that I would get from investors was always about your name.
So the origin of the company name is I think twofold. There is first of all kind of a serious story of it, which is what we also told the Wall Street Journal and all of that, which is that if you analogize intelligent systems to airplanes, the current intelligent systems, the current AI, are these gigantic, hulking, metal composite, 787s with big, engines on them, and the field is great, let's build bigger engines, let's just make the airplanes go faster. And in the analogy, we didn't want to go all the way to birds. We're not ready to go replicate humans per se, but we want to go somewhere between the two, right? So build systems that are a little bit more like birds while still being fundamentally like airplanes in nature. The other story of it, though, of course, is that there was a moment in our founding history, as you know, where sort of we very rapidly had to go incorporate the thing. And I just needed a name that I could go put on the Delaware entity because I was like, and you want a name to be distinctive. You could always find a DBA later. So there's lots of options here. But I frankly did think it was funny to troll the investors and lawyers a little bit with everyone has to have flapping airplanes incorporated their spreadsheet. I just love it. It actually makes me happy every time I think about it. It's a constant fountain of joy in my life.
And just the contrast with the rest of the industry is so good.
I think a core tenet that I've seen come through from you guys is just that you don't take yourselves too seriously. In fact, you take yourselves quite unseriously, which I think is appealing to the kind of folks that you're trying to attract to this company. Maybe you could share a little bit just about the culture that you're building and the set of folks that you already have on board.
So exactly as you said, I think our culture is that we don't take ourselves too seriously, but we do incredibly serious work. So we really care about kind of our work leading the way of the company. That actually we think we don't want to go out and trumpet too much of we're going to go change the world or whatnot. No, we have goals here, but we'll see. I hope that the next sort of thing that the world sees from us is that we've actually gone and done something really interesting and cool, which we're of course actively working on right now. In terms of the team itself, it includes an International Math Olympiad perfect score. It includes IOI gold medalists, International Physics Olympiad gold medalists. It includes a bunch of creative geometric thinkers, Cyrus on our team I learned this 2 days ago, can slice 4-dimensional objects in his head, just visualize them geometrically. I cannot do it.
If he tries hard enough.
What? Yeah, 5 if he tries hard enough, which is actually nuts to me. We had very different approaches to solving this random problem.
We've got also a high schooler who has to write English essays about his experience at the company so he can graduate high school.
You had to do a call with his principal, right?
Yes, I actually did the call. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Great call.
Well, actually, so a funny thing on that, maybe one question one might have is why would you hire a high schooler, for this company? Does a high schooler know anything? And the answer is actually, there are some places where someone with a little bit more experience, they may know a little bit more math, they may have seen a little bit more of the things, but actually, for example, when it comes to using the tools, these days, almost all coding is being done agentically. Almost all the lines of code are written by an AI in some form, being guided by a human. Actually, the best in the world at that are not the senior experienced people. It's like the high schooler who's been vibing with this stuff for the last 3 years that actually knows how to do this better than anyone else. And so part of the reason that we were very excited to bring our high schooler on board was that we sort of thought about it. We're like, who should be the best in the world at this? Actually, yeah, it's probably him. It's probably Wes.
So you have a Harvard national debate champion and Stanford PhD, a Thiel fellow and Neuralink researcher, and I want to talk about prod as well. Before we get to prod, would just love to hear, you were at a GV portfolio company, Neuralink, and it's one that we love, obviously, and think the world of. Would love to hear a little bit more about how that experience ties into your experience at Flapping Airplanes.
Yeah, one I love as well. Incredibly good feelings towards the company and the people there. It's a really, really great organization, and I'm excited for the future of BCI. But really spending a lot of time there just got me thinking about the brain, and really thinking about the ways the brain is good and the way the brain is not good. And you look at ML systems, and again, they have this really strange set of trade-offs, and you're like, okay, your brain, so slow, utterly laconic, and yet, manages to perform much better than some of these frontier systems on certain challenges here. And so I think it's really encouraging us to go and look at the brain, again, in this flapping airplanes motif, not as this fundamental source of truth, but as just a bit of inspiration for how these things can be different and how we as an organization can operate differently.
Bit of neurology, understanding of the brain, maybe biomimicry?
A little bit of this stuff. We don't want to totally tie ourselves to pins, physically inspired neural networks, but there are a lot of great ideas there, and a lot that really have not seen their time in the limelight because the transformer thing has worked so well. And so really spending time thinking about these things harder and trying new ways of approaching these old ideas is going to serve us really well as an organization, and we're really, really excited to spend time there.
Yeah, just to add on to this, one example here is that the brain is very sparse. And sparsity is traditionally a regularization method that is employed when you have not a lot of data and a lot of parameters. And broadly, the regime the field has been in for the past 5 years is one where we actually have more data than parameters because we are primarily constrained by compute, and this is the most compute-efficient way to train models. But if you start moving to different regimes where you have vastly less data and vastly more compute, suddenly regularization makes a lot more sense. And the brain is notably very sparse. It's possible to take some broad inspiration there without literally mimicking exactly what the brain is doing.
Yeah, and we're deeply inspired by the fact that 3-year-olds have 60% more synapses than you or I, and what's up with that? More parameters. And so we look at this and we think, okay, clearly there's some new regularization happening here. Clearly the way that the brain is doing circuit search or the way the brain is learning is very, very different from the ML orthodoxy today, and we should be exploring things closer to that in the frontier.
Fantastic. And Asher, your background is in statistics.
That's right.
Curious to hear from you, just are there connections between your study of statistics, your work in your PhD, and the company as well?
I did a bunch of actually NLP work in my undergrad, and I sort of very intentionally chose to do a statistics PhD and not a CS PhD at that point in time. The reason for that was just that I felt like my advisor at Harvard, Lucas Jansen, was the person who I knew who thought most clearly about data and learning from data. And the amount of information he could extract from a plot was really spectacular to me, and that was really inspiring, and that's what I tried to learn at Stanford in my PhD. I really do think that embodies what we're trying to do here, which is try to think clearly about what the field as a whole is doing. The systems seem like magic, but they're not magic. We're picking functions out of function classes. And on the one hand, we have trained incredibly intelligent systems. We've also done it on the entirety of all of recorded human history that's accessible, whereas humans are trained on 1 million times less data and are much more robustly intelligent. I think thinking clearly about that problem and other problems that the field has kind of, maybe taken for granted or not focused quite on as much is exactly what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to that, I think one part of that comes out as well, which I think you mentioned earlier, is really the point around being in different regimes. That I think the field is filled with lots of smart people, and at other organizations, there are many, many brilliant people. I think our aim is not to say that we think that everyone else is dumb and wrong and we're the only smart ones here that are going to do it, but actually rather that we put ourselves in different regimes than others, and then just think very carefully, okay, what's going on when you're in this regime? And if you're in a very different regime and things that you care about and different constraints that you have, this is actually the right kind of background to have, inspired creativity and create different outcomes and, different models. So, I wouldn't say we're trying to be, better than the frontier per se as much as it is we're really trying to be different.
So Ben, you obviously have a storied background at both MIT and at Stanford under Chris Ray, and the research work that you've done there. But I think you're most well known in the Valley for your founding of Prod, the sort of very mysterious incubator that very few, I think, technologists in the Valley know about, but almost every investor knows about. I have talked to many of the investors that have tried to invest in your company, and one of the things most of them say is like, "Oh, I tried to hire Ben. Like, I would have done many different things to try and convince him to join our firm as an investor." And I'm sort of also in that category, trying to hire you in multiple different ways in almost any capacity. Curious, can you share a little bit about Prod and then how that connects into your experiences in the Valley?
Yeah. So Prod is a somewhat strange organization in certain ways. It's a nonprofit. We just help students build companies. I think, we are distinguished from other nonprofit student incubators in that our companies are good. So this is sort of where we just try to let the work kind of lead the way, kind of similarly to what I was, alluding to earlier. Prod has, it does almost no marketing of itself. Like it's really meant to be kind of an underground vibe. I think at the end of the day, I can talk for actually a very long time about all the different things that Prod does, but I think that Prod's recipe is actually fairly straightforward. First of all, it's go find incredibly smart young people and help them figure out what they want from their lives. And actually, to be clear, it's not always entrepreneurships. In fact, probably the most common thing that we do with students that we work with is we say, hey, actually, maybe entrepreneurship isn't the right fit for you, right? It actually seems like you want things that are different from this. Not that you couldn't do it, of course you could do it, but actually for what you say you want, this is actually a very bad answer. But then there's some subset where it really does make sense. And then we go to them and we say, great, let's just help. Let's just work on this company. And I think the thing I'll emphasize for one of the things I think has been distinguished about Prod is we take a very bottom-up view towards companies. So if you look at Prod as an incubator kind of from a top-down perspective, it looks like the worst incubator in the world. Because it's like, we don't give you any money, we don't give you any resources, we don't promise you anything that we'll do in particular, like none of the above. I guess at this point, maybe the brand is valuable for people, but historically that really was not something that was valuable. But rather our approach is to say, all great companies in the early stages are actually special snowflakes. They all have to be unique by their nature in order to become very valuable. If it was something repeatable, people would do it over and over again, it would be exploited out, it wouldn't be in part of the market. So they kind of all have to be special. And the thing that each company needs at a particular time, whether it's funding or it's talent or it's just like knowing what they want to work on or getting their first customer, whatever that is, these things are all very unique. So we really try to work with them from the bottom up and help them get there. Now, the way that this connects back, I think, to the company is that this has actually very much informed how we think about how we are bringing along. That in some sense, I am, if I think about my previous role as an incubator, I feel like I'm incubating, but at a very, very close, 5th grade level while I'm helping to, run the company. And so for us, each day, each week, we're really asking ourselves, what is the thing that gets us to the next step of where the company needs to go? And then what are all the resources we can draw on? And our goal is to basically let everything else burn for that week while we solve that thing. And then once it's solved, go on to the next piece of it and kind of, be marching along step by step.
I think a parallel that we saw in our partnership was just, at a time when there were hundreds of incubators in the ecosystem. Each university that you were working with, MIT and Harvard at the time, and now Stanford and a bunch of Israeli institutions, and I'm sure dozens of other institutions. At the time, each one of those organizations, each one of those universities had some sort of incubator there, rather than just copying the sort of format that everybody else was pursuing. And YC had a fairly successful approach so far. You really went in a totally different direction, which was to go down to first principles and say, what is the thing that matters most in a startup? And it's actually like the agency of the humans and the people that are involved. And then what would be most appealing to the super high agency humans? And it was like other high agency humans and actually rejecting all of the brand and dollars, et cetera, associated with all the other incubators. You're obviously closer to it than I am, but I see a lot of parallels between what you're trying to build here and that approach, and that you're sort of zigging when everyone else is zagging, and you're appealing to a different kind of employee and entrepreneur, founder, co-founders, et cetera, and that's one of the things that gets us really excited here.
I think that's totally right. I think one of my both character strengths and weaknesses is that when I see the crowds running one way, I just instinctively run the other direction. And the reason why I say this is a weakness is that it's not as principled as I'd like to make it out to be. It'd be great if it was like, oh, I knew the right times to run with and the right times to run against, but it's not really how I work. It's more just that I'm bored if I'm running with the crowd, and I'm very motivated by my boredom, that if I'm bored by something, I will just try to make it interesting. And I'm having way more fun, it's way more interesting when I'm like running against the crowd. Now, this has, I will say not every time I've done this has it worked. Sometimes you do it and it's like, oh, there was a good reason everyone was running that way,
As you build this culture, the culture of the company, what other sort of core tenets do you feel like you'll have in how you select the people, how you want them to show up on a daily basis, and what the vibe is?
I think for me, one of the key ones is really, seeking the right answer, whatever that is, that the whole company has to be oriented around finding whatever the right answer is. If that means that we were doing some project for 3 months and we just realized, it's the wrong thing to do, great, stop it, 3 months are gone, doesn't matter, on to whatever the right thing is. I think a big part of how, one achieves this from a cultural point of view is that you actually need people to be nice for this to work. Like, I think there are some approaches to, really radical transparency that actually don't work because they lead towards people not being nice. And you might say, well, everyone should have no ego, but actually people have egos, you need to work with that and not ignore it. So you need people to be nice about it. But at the same time, you need people to be very blunt and disagreeable with each other, disagreeable not in the unkind sense, but in the clear sense that, hey, I don't think this makes any sense. This is what it needs to be. And I think if you create if you have a lot of smart, creative people, and they're all saying that to each other, pretty quickly you converge on really interesting ideas that have a really good shot at being right. I would say, in fact, if I look at our trajectory so far as a company, I feel extremely confident we have a bunch of really creative, interesting, different, weird ideas that are not being pursued broadly. I would say, it is now on us to go execute on those things and get it to work. That's the part that we're sort of, the next hill for us to go climb is to show that these things have value. But I've been incredibly encouraged by our ability to do things that are like outside the box already.
The other piece of the culture that I think is important, and this is actually something I've learned from Prod, is that the ambition of what you choose to do really matters. Like, something we joke about as a company is that, like, we don't run hyperparameter searches. Like, it's not true, like, we actually do. But, like, broadly speaking, we are not interested in tweaking residual connections to, like, make the model, like, 10% more efficient. Like, this is just not what we're doing as an organization. It's incredibly valuable work and someone should do it, but not us. And the other thing that we look for in people we want to work with is, like, they are taking aim at a really big problem and they want to work on something that can change the field. And that's basically, we broadly let people work on things they want to work on. That's basically our only criterion, is like, if we can't see how it's ambitious and important, then that's the only time we step in and say, like, are you sure this is the thing you want to work on?
You've done a phenomenal job of recruiting from some of the most interesting places in our ecosystem. I guess I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that sort of first conversation usually goes with prospective recruits as they learn more about you.
I've actually found that our first conversations have been pretty straightforward on this. I think in part because our top of funnel, in some sense, of like the people we're talking to are kind of already in the network and are in some ways already primed because they're friends with it. So, actually, maybe this is worth a very brief tangent. The way that Prod has always done its recruiting was actually very much outbound focused rather than inbound focused. You find people you think are really smart, and you say, great, who are your smartest friends? And you sort of ply your way through the network that way. One of the benefits of this is that because everyone's friends, they kind of know, oh yeah, this person just joined to go do this thing, and so they're already primed a little bit for it. So for us, I think the question basically becomes, we tell them a little bit about what we're doing and what we're excited by, but it's actually a question of like, what do you want? Like, what are you excited by? What are the problems that you think are interesting?
The AI market is sort of famous for being quite leaky. Like, the researchers talk to each other, they share what each lab is working on. I know you're not making a product announcement, a research announcement. You're not sharing the results of some of your research or even the hypotheses that you're going after. But when you sit down and talk to recruits, it must be a set of conversations. People are very curious about, like, what is your angle? How do you address that, and what do you share?
Yeah, I think we actually are very comfortable to share sort of stylistic, like, these are the kinds of ideas we're interested in. I think a big part of it is that there's actually so many ideas that one can come up with that are all like broadly in similar-ish regimes that it's actually not like the defensible part. The defensible part is actually the kind of taste and intuition about which ones you're actually going to go pursue and how you're going to pursue them and the details you're going to get right in doing that. And so I actually don't have too much fear on that point. I'll also say that I guess as a maybe more slightly more philosophical point, it is true that research in the Valley is leaky, and this is why I think we do not intend to be commercially protected by our research forever. I think that research is a thing that you do to build capability that gives you an edge and a lead somewhere, but then you need to find a way to build something more defensible via more vertical integration or customer relationships and distribution or data moats or things like that. And so it's a research from a kind of pure company building perspective is actually a means to an end. It's actually hard for it to be the end unto itself.
Well, we feel super fortunate to partner with all three of you and we're really excited about this journey. And thanks so much for trusting us. We look forward to the path ahead.
Likewise, we are super excited to be in business with you guys. So thank you so much.
We really appreciate it.
Awesome.